Hello and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Today we're going to be talking about the evidence for evolution. So let's hop right into it. The first piece of evidence is the fossil record. Only sedimentary rocks contain fossils. That's because metamorphic and igneous rocks are way too hot for fossils to form. And sedimentary rock layers are deposited over top of one another, which we've learned before in earth science and middle school classes. But what happens is that fossils get trapped inside those sedimentary rock layers, and we have a kind of a record of the oldest rocks on the bottom and the youngest rocks on the top. And what we see is that fossils found in the lower rocks are older. We do this through different dating techniques, not going on dates, dating techniques. And so then what we find is that we can see fossils changing over time. So, for example, in this picture, you can take a look at trilobites, and you can see these spines that come off the head. You can see they're kind of attached towards the base, and then as time goes on, they begin to be attached farther up and farther up on the trilobite head. So, just kind of one of the pieces of evidence. Now, one of the more compelling pieces of evidence that we see with the fossil record is our what are called transition fossils. And transition fossils help us to kind of see the changes between ancestral species and extant relatives. So basically what we're looking at is okay, species that are the common ancestors, for several different species, and then we've got fossils along the way that show us the differences between them and how the process occurred, kind of some of the changes along the way, whether or not those are physiological. Well, obviously, there's going to have to be physiological changes that we're looking at because we can't really look at behaviors. And we will never find every single transition fossil out there. That's just not going to happen. There's, very particular conditions have to take place in order for fossils to form. But that is not necessarily a knock against evolution because there is such a large number of transition fossils that we do find. The age of the Earth is also a large part of this. Evolution, we've talked about before, requires a large amount of time, and through different types of radioactive dating processes, we have estimated that the age of the Earth is right around 4.6 billion years old, and that life first started around 3.9 billion years ago, giving lots and lots of time for the process of evolution to take place. Anatomical evidence is the next piece of evidence we're going to take a look at. And within anatomical evidence, we are going to be looking at 4 different things. We're going to take a look at homologous structures, analogous structures, vestigial structures, and comparative embryology. And these are all clues that have been left in modern species. So we're not looking at fossils, we're looking at the anatomy of current species. So homologous structures are similar structures that show a common ancestor, and they are similar between different species. So the classic example is the upper limb structure of tetrapods, which are animals that have 4 limbs. Specifically, we look at mammals, and you can see how we have the same basic bones that we find in all of these species. However, they have different functions. So a human's hand is for grasping and manipulating, a cat's foot is for climbing and running, a whale's flipper is for swimming, and a bat's wing is for flying. However, they all have the same underlying bone structure, showing that they probably all evolved from a common ancestor that had that same bone structure, and then over time the bones have changed shape slightly to fit whatever their specific function is in each different environment. We also see homology in plants. So a lot of times when we look at plants, we might think that they have, structures that are significantly different from leaves, and that's true. However, those are simply modified leaves. So, for example, carnivorous plants such as pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, they have modified their leaves into different structures that help them catch insects. Poinsettias, which you might be seeing a lot of right now, given that it is Christmas time, are bright red leaves. Those are not actually flowers. The flowers are just simply the little white pieces or yellow pieces in the center of the poinsettia. And then a cactus, the spines are actually leaves that have changed structure over time. So we see homology in a lot of different places throughout all of life. And next we have analogous structures. These are structures that have similar structure or function. However, they have different development. And they have different underlying structure. So this is a type of convergent evolution. So for example, if we take a look at insect wings and we compare those to wings found in either pterosaurs or birds or bats, we see that they are significantly different. However, they have the same underlying function. And basically what this tells us is that life has evolved and adapted to similar conditions from different places, and it arrives at a similar plan for how to deal with those conditions. So insects having flight and birds having flight, they have evolved to that from a different evolutionary past, but they still are evolving in the same environment. So therefore, they end up with a similar type of structure, which is able to perform a similar function. Another example of this would be fish and dolphins and whales, right? Dolphins and whales are mammals. They evolved from terrestrial creatures. However, they have a very similar structure in terms of their body plan to fish because they are both living inside the water. So they're going to need to be able to have similar, be able to adapt, have similar adaptations to be able to survive within that. Another excellent example is eye formation in cephalopods, which includes octopus, which is this eye over here, and vertebrates, including humans. And you can see that the function is going to be pretty similar, right? They're both used for visual things, seeing things. However, the way that they form is very different. You can see the different stages. Even though the structure itself at the end is very similar, how they develop is much far different, and it kind of again shows the evolutionary relationships. The next one we have is the vestigial structures. These are structures that currently in modern species serve little or no purpose, and they are the remains of structures that were once functional in ancestral species. So a great example of this is the pelvis in whales. Whales are believed to have evolved from species that are similar to a horse, and eventually they evolved to live in the water. However, they still have a pelvic bone, and you can actually see this in modern whales as well as recent whale ancestors. In humans, we currently have the appendix, which is debatable as to whether or not that's actually a vestigial structure. However, it is certainly on its way to becoming vestigial if it isn't already. We have the coccyx, which is our tailbone. That is actually a vestigial little tail, and there are people who are actually born with little tails. And then you can have goosebumps, right? Goosebumps are when you get the little hairs on your arm that maybe stand up when you're cold or when you're fear. You get those little bumps. Those bumps are actually found in all other mammal species that have hair, and for them it actually is useful because they have much more fur going on. For us, it doesn't really do anything. Finally, we've got comparative embryology. This is where species that have a common ancestry tend to have similar embryos, and it is seen very well in vertebrate species. So, for example, chickens and humans, right? We both have pharyngeal pouches or pharyngeal slits is another word, as well as a post-anal tail in the embryos. And you can see in general how similar the embryos look to one another. And if you were to look at all vertebrate species, you would see this very similar form early in development. And then as development continues forward, the embryos begin to look more and more like the offspring, the newborn forms, and so they begin to look more and more dissimilar. Another big piece of evidence for evolution is molecular homology, right? All of life uses essentially the same molecules for storing information, which is DNA, sometimes RNA, but pretty much most of the time DNA. All use the same molecules, RNA and proteins, for making use of that information. And then all of life uses ATP for storing and using energy, right? So these are really strong trends that tell us that, we must have all evolved from something that use these three things, right? And then over time, we have all developed, variations of things based off of that. So what we do is we use similarities in DNAs and proteins sequences to map evolutionary relationships, which is biotechnology. We just got finished talking about that in our last unit. And again, we're going to be doing a lab where you all are going to use DNA sequences to map out evolutionary relationships. Another strong example is artificial selection, right? This is a kind of evolution that we can see occurring. So this is where humans choose specific traits to breed for within a population, and we create more diversity and or create specific breeds. So we see this in all the different dog breeds. We see this in all of our different food crops. We see this in all of our animals that we breed for food or for milk or whatever it is that we want them to produce. And we can see the changes that occur over time. And if you were to take DNA samples, you would also be able to see DNA samples changing over time as well. And then finally, almost finally, we've got biogeography. This is where organisms found within a particular area are more closely related than those found in other areas. So what we're saying is that, okay, we have a group of organisms that live in one spot. They are all much more closely related to one another than they are with organisms that come from maybe somewhere else in the world. And also, organisms within an area tend to share similar characteristics as well. And what we're kind of talking about is, in the second piece, is that organisms that live in similar environments tend to share similar characteristics. So organisms that live in deserts across the world share similar characteristics, even though they might be kind of far apart from one another. Organisms that live in mountains across the world tend to kind of share some characteristics. And what we're seeing here is that you've got evolution that is occurring where you're evolving to your environment, right? You're adapting to your environment. So if you live in mountains, then you're going to need to have some certain characteristics, no matter where you are in the world, they're going to be beneficial, that are going to help you survive. Another kind of interesting example of this is between marsupials and eutherian mammals, which is just another word for placental mammals. So we can actually see a lot of convergent evolution between these species, where we have species that have evolved from different lines. So marsupial mammals are being found mostly in Australia, and placental mammals found pretty much everywhere else. But you can see that when they live in similar environments, they will actually develop very similar characteristics, even very similar body plans in terms of what they actually accomplish. And then finally, observed evolution. We've talked about drug and pesticide resistance a little bit, but just a brief recap, this is where when we give either a drug to somebody or we spray pesticides, either some of the bacteria or virus or some of the pests are going to be resistant to that. And so because those are the only ones that are going to survive, they are going to then reproduce and pass on their alleles to the next generation. And over time, the entire population will become resistant to that drug or pesticide. Another classic example are the peppered moths in Great Britain. So before the 1880s or so, before the Industrial Revolution, there were mostly light-colored moths, and there were still the two varieties, either the dark color or the light color, and you can see those here. But the light-colored moths tended to be more prevalent because the trees were much lighter. However, after the Industrial Revolution, there was much more soot that was being put up into the air. This was actually killing off lichen that was covering the bark of the trees, and that ended up with making the trees be a much darker color. So now the dark color moths are much more adapted, right? They're going to be able to hide on the bark much easier. The light color moths are going to be picked off more, as you can kind of see in this picture. It's much easier to see the light colored one. And so the alleles shifted to favor the dark colored moths, and you started to see many more dark colored moths. After some clean air acts were passed where the amount of soot was reduced significantly, the lichen was able to grow on the bark trees again, the bark trees became lighter, and then the light colored moths became more prevalent over time. So, we have observed, and this is just one example, we have observed many different instances of evolution taking place. And so, it's really hard to kind of say, well, what's going on here, right? Well, it's evolution, just on a much smaller scale than necessarily speciation, creating new species. So, just one little thing, last thing to clean up. Current species do not represent a perfect form. Rather, current species represent organisms that are very well adapted to current environmental conditions. So if conditions were to change, that would drive the process of evolution to change organisms as well. And we're starting to see some of that as climate change is occurring. We're seeing organisms have to adapt to the changing environments. But I think a lot of times we tend to think of like, oh, well, we humans are the most evolutionary perfect. We're the top of the food chain. Well, we are obviously very well adapted to living in our environment. However, if our environment were to change, we may not be as well adapted to the new environment as maybe some other species. So just kind of something to keep in mind. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.